And then at the end, I've put a slide about historiographical schools of thought. Now, you don't have to learn this for the exam. You don't need to mention it in the exam. So it's a bit of extra knowledge, really. If it confuses you, just ignore it. But it does mention it in the textbook, and I didn't want you to be confused and not understand that. So I'll just do a quick explanation, but feel free to completely ignore this bit if you don't understand it. So in history, we've got what's called the study of history is known as historiography. So it's basically studying how people study history. And so you get what are called different schools of thought. And for every historical event that's got some kind of debate surrounding its origins or causes, for example, the First World War or the Cold War, or the Glorious Revolution, there's always debate surrounding that by different historians. So you get different schools of thought where people argue different things. A good example of this that you're going to need to understand for next year is to do with the Cold War. The original Western historians at the beginning of the Cold War and through the, sort of the 50s were known as orthodox historians, and they believed that the Soviets and Stalin were evil and had caused the Cold War. You then get what are called revisionists. They revise the original viewpoint and they started to say things like, well, maybe it was America and maybe it was the West's fault. And then you get post-revisionists who question that again, and then you get different schools of thought emerging. So that's an example for the Cold War. You can also apply that similar practice to the Glorious Revolution. So in this particular historical debate, we start with what were called Whig historians. Now, Whigs, as we've looked at, were a political party that emerged who opposed the power of the monarchy and wanted more power for the Parliament. So Whig history is linked to that idea in a way. Whig history is an approach to studying history where they see history as a kind of inevitable progression towards greater liberty and enlightenment and freedom and more kind of liberal democracy. So in that sense, Whig historians, or sometimes Whiggish historians, believe that the 1688 events, which they called the Glorious Revolution, were a positive event leading to a pathway towards much more greater freedom, greater parliamentary control, the decline of monarchical tyranny, and so on. So they saw it as a really positive step in the right direction, which eventually would bring parliamentary power and the decline of the monarchy, which ties in with the idea that Whig politicians believed. On top of that, you've then got people who question the Whig viewpoint of history and say it wasn't necessarily a natural progression towards a better thing, but actually they revise that, they question that, and there's different types of revisionist viewpoint. So some revisionists would say actually the Whigs underestimate just how radical a revolution this was. It was far more radical than they gave it credit for. Other revisionists say actually it's been over-exaggerated, it changed very little. So a revisionist by nature does not have one specific viewpoint. A revisionist is just somebody who questions the original argument. So in this case, the original view is that it was a glorious revolution, it was on a pathway to a more progressive society. Revisionists question that in different ways, but they question the premise that the Whigs put forward. And lastly, mentioned in the book are Marxist historians, people like Christopher Hill. You've learned about Marxism with Russia, but basically they suggest that there was a shift in power, as the Whigs suggest, but actually that the power shift was not enough. Regardless of whether it was the monarchy or the Parliament, power still lay with the wealthy elite, and the life of the ordinary person did not change. So whether it was Parliament or monarchy, it doesn't matter, because they were all rich people. Ordinary people's lives did not change. So when you're looking at this section of the book, you will find, and when you're making some notes on it, you will find references to Whig historians, Marxist historians, revisionism. Don't worry about that in terms of needing to learn it for an exam, needing to know names of historians that fit in particular ones. You don't have to know that. But it's interesting in terms of your study of history to understand it. Some of you might want to look into that a little bit more. If you're thinking of going to do history at university, or if you really enjoy reading history at home, it's something to be aware of. And actually historiographical schools of thought and historiography as a study are really, really interesting and help you to understand a lot about historians. If you're interested in finding out a bit more about that, there's a brilliant book by E.H. Carr called What is History? And he looks all into the study of history and how we write history and how it's made, and he talks a lot about understanding the historian before you study what they write. And actually that's kind of what we're looking at a little bit here, is understanding who that person is to understand why they've written the perspective they have. Now, as I say, you don't have to know about this for the exam. If it's confusing, you can ignore it. But what is important is that there are different viewpoints. And as with everything in history, people disagree. People would put something as perhaps more significant than something else. We always talk about that with factors in our essays. Some people will put something as more significant than another thing. And that's the same principle here, is that when you're looking at these 4 debates, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer to them. There's different perspectives. And what you're going to be asked to do is look at 2 extracts, consider them, decide which one you think is more persuasive, which one you agree with the most, and you're going to use the knowledge that you've built on these debates to either back it up or to critique it and say, actually, this one's not so persuasive because it doesn't mention this, or it overlooks the importance of this aspect. Or this one's much stronger because it includes statistical evidence on this, 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 and this. So you need to learn the information. You need to be able to then apply that to the different debates and have an understanding and a viewpoint on what you think of them. And then you need to basically analyse the extracts. After a few weeks of learning the information, we'll come back to this idea of analysing extracts, and I will do another video where I explain a bit more about how to do that, and we'll give you some instructions, and we'll have a go at doing some of those. But what's important to do for the moment is to get stuck into these 4 different debates. We're going to put some resources on Insight for you to have a go at doing that. You don't need to learn nearly as much detail as the other 4 chapters, so we'll just do 1 topic a week, and you'll get through those in the next 4 weeks. Good luck!